Hi, good evening everyone. I'm Julia Bryan-Wilson. I'm the Doris and Clarence Mallow Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art in the Art History Department here at Berkeley, and also the Director of the Arts Research Center. And I want to welcome you to this event that I'm really excited about. I want to first begin by acknowledging that this event and every event at UC Berkeley takes place on the unceded territory of the Ohlone peoples, and to pay respectful tribute to this place as their ancestral home. I also want to give my gratitude to Lauren Pearson and Laurie McBee, my staff at the Arts Research Center, who make my job so easy. And I want to also tell you about a few upcoming events, one of which is next Thursday, February 27th. The Horace Ballard, curator at the Williams College Museum of Art, will be talking about the exhibition that he curated about queer social media. And it was really an interesting, groundbreaking use of the museum space to talk about more informal exchanges of lens-based materials. So and the talk is called Contingent Intimacies. He'll be in conversation after that with Justin Underhill. And then the following Thursday, March 5th, a really exciting event, which is about trans visual cultures with the extremely renowned artist Tourmaline, as well as Chris Vargas, also renowned, who is the founder of the Museum of Transgender History and Art. And they will be in conversation with Eric Stanley, who teaches here in the Gender Women's Studies Department at Berkeley. So I hope to see you all there. Two great events coming up. I also want to acknowledge that this event was co-sponsored by the Department of Music, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, and the Theater and Dance and Performance Studies departments, and I'm really grateful to all of these different units for helping bring Shayna to campus. It's her first time in Berkeley, and I was saying that she picked the most dazzling day of spring to arrive. It's like at peak beauty here, I think. And we're just
thinking you can see the tan here.
Yeah. So I will introduce our speaker and then her respondent, and then turn things over to Shayna. Shayna Silverstein received her BA in history from Yale and a PhD in ethnomusicology from the University of Chicago. She's currently an assistant professor of performance studies at Northwestern, where she teaches courses on sound cultures, performance ethnography, and sonic practices in the Middle East and North Africa. Shayna is a specialist in Syrian dance and music and has published her research in volumes that include Punk Ethnography, a book I need, that's an amazing title, The Arab Avant-Garde, and Syria from Reform to Revolts. And her research has been funded by a Fulbright, as well as by the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and a Mellon postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania Humanities Forum. In addition to her academic scholarship on performance, she is also an active practitioner, participating in Middle Eastern dance and music ensembles. And her talk tonight draws on her book manuscript in progress, entitled Performing Dabke, Popular Culture and Identity in Contemporary Syria. After her talk, Shayna will be joined in conversation with Dina Chalabi, who is a visiting scholar with us at the Arts Research Center this year. From 2014 to 2019, she was Associate Curator of Public Dialogue at SF MoMA, where she co-curated Public Knowledge, a multifaceted initiative funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities that was created in partnership with the San Francisco Public Library, a really amazing and important initiative that I was really honored to be part of. Dina was also the founding head of strategy at Motifs, Arab Museum of Modern Art in Qatar, which opened to the public in 2020. Please join me in welcoming Shayna.
Thank you all for joining us today. This is a wonderful turnout, and I'm really happy to be here. I'd like to begin today with a moment of silence in order to honor and recognize the millions who have been affected by the Syrian war, especially those who are currently being displaced and fleeing Idlib. So if we can all gather together. Thank you. Thank you. Bright fluorescent lights beam across an outdoor courtyard at an evening celebration in Saran, a Syrian village in the inland region of Hama. A young man leads a line of 15 or so male dancers. They repeat codified sequences of footsteps as they move in a counterclockwise circular direction around the courtyard, creating a circular form known as a shekel da'ra. The young man has clasped hands with the young man on his left, as you can see here. Moving together, they ground each other's sense of balance and rhythm. Flooding the courtyard is the shrill timbre of midras, a reed instrument synthesized for electronic keyboard that repeats melodic motifs for a mystifying electroacoustic effect. A double-barrel drum player, circulates, pounding heavy bass rhythms and treble tremolos that erratically stress the dancer's rhythmic movements. The young man enlarges his agile legwork. Sprite and light, he bounds across the space, still clasping hands with his fellow dancer. He breaks from the line to improvise in the center of the dancers. Here, his knee bends are deep, and his solo work is virtuosic and highly stylized. He lunges, spins, twists, and rotates, all synchronized with the duple meter groove of the Dabke rhythms. In October 2014, a Syrian friend tagged me on this grainy and low-resolution video shared widely across Arabic language users on Facebook. According to village locals, Syrian and the nearby village of Morak are considered famous for their dancers. Locals claim 3 styles of Dabke as their own, Walda, Darja, and Shaktiya. When several villagers viewed this video on my request, by way of an interlocutor, Suhail Shadud, they identified the movements as Shakiya Sariya, or a quick version of Shakiya, which literally translates to Eastern or Oriental. Viewers across Facebook admired the anonymous Dabke, which is the word for one who Dabkes well, for his rhythmic precision. They offered praise with compliments like "Helwa, Yareit," sweet, how awesome. But his virtuosity alone was not what made the video go viral. Syrians loved his performance because the dance was so clearly local, and because Syrians hold Arif, the countryside, dear to their hearts. It is not incidental that this video of Dabke and Syrian circulated in October 2014, by which time the Syrian conflict was militarized. You can see the general area in that blue circle there. Syrian is an agricultural village with a pre-war population of approximately 33,000. It was hard hit by the war when it became contested territory between the Syrian army and rebels. Engulfed in violence, the uncertainty of what was happening to Syrian likely fueled the making of the video into a lieu de mémoire, or site of memory, that mediated nostalgia and a sense of loss for Syrian and more broadly for the Syrian village. If the village's symbolic social space has historically provided a sense of generational continuity for Syrians throughout modernization and urbanization, a continuity now severed by war, conflict, and crisis, the instability of this space transformed it into an object of affective attachment, of empathy, trauma, alienation, and horror. The viral circulation of a video featuring Syrian and his fabulous Dabke, perhaps from 2008, it's not clear when the video itself was originally taken. It can be explained as part of the transformation of the Syrian village into a site of loss, space of grief, and object of nostalgia. As a close friend put it, quote, "This video makes me wish I could return to my village, where I Dabke on my wedding day, and dance again in its terroir," end quote. And I should add that as part of the tragedy and trauma that continues among Syrians, this friend just recently lost his father, but is unable to go attend his father's funeral because he's unable to return to Syria. In my broader research project on the role of performance in negotiating gender, ethnicity, religion, and class in Syria, I used Dabke practice to spotlight how people negotiate the deep rifts that have cleaved through Syrian society pre-war and wartime. A participatory performance practice that enjoins community, Dabke literally means to stomp the ground with one's feet. It is widely considered a pre-Islamic Arab performance tradition practice across the region, with some debate whether the term Dabke is itself of Arabic origin. Dabke is central to how belonging is sustained in kinship networks, grounded by a sense of place, maintained through communitarian rituals, and constituted through structures of feeling that bind individuals and groups among and across habitus. Since the mid-20th century, these local practices have been adapted to reimagine Dabke as Syria's national folk dance. Local musical performances have been commodified into popular music by media economies during processes of urbanization and modernization. And since the revolution, Dabke has also entered the repertoire of conflict. In brief, this cultural practice inhabits a domain of public culture that is crucial for understanding how belonging is lived, constructed, and contested in contemporary Syria. It is tempting to assume that Dabke brings people together because, like many performance traditions, it embodies resistance and utopia and collectivism. I could speak at length about how Dabke restores trust in community in the face of social conflict and breakdown. It is true that performance can engender a utopic sense of commonality between and among Syrians that empowers people to persist in their hopes for a better future while surviving the cataclysmic present. The power to craft these visions through the performance of Dabke was realized, for instance, when people marked the arrival of medical supplies across a conflict zone to a Red Cross hospital with the Dabke circle. It also embodied collective relief when migrants crossing the Mediterranean practiced Dabke on the Greek shoreline after their safe arrival. Perhaps this phenomenon can be attributed to the utopian performative, what Jill Dolan calls a sense of utopia that merges, quote, in the interstices of present interactions and glancing moments of possibly better ways to be together as human beings, end quote. I am wary, however, of being overly optimistic of the effects of participatory collective action, which more often than not are endowed with the politics of resistance and emancipation by scholars who advocate for underrepresented and marginalized groups. Performative effects of collective participatory action are not always utopic. Where there is emancipatory politics of the body often at play, embodied practices are also a site for hegemony to reproduce itself, for assertions of power and domination. Even as Dabke celebrates family kinship and place of origin, participants in the Dabke circle often reproduce hegemonic masculinity in a patriarchal society through, for instance, the privileging of male participation in the Dabke circle. Dabke also moves into the darker domain of war propaganda, from dancing at the front lines of a battle to political contestations between popular music videos as they circulate in network public life. Though Dabke often constructs a utopic sense of well-being communalism, I argue that this cultural practice also perpetuates power, antagonizes conflict, and incites warfare. Today with you, I'll unpack the multivalent effects of these performative doings, detailing how Dabke practice fragments and polarizes at the same time that it engenders belonging and solidarity within and among communities. In my broader project, I strive for a balance of recognition between how performance solidifies social groups and how it aggravates social divisions. One of the primary aims of my project is to look at the ways in which Syrians of differing backgrounds and worldviews relate to each other in order to question whether and how the particular forms of identity and difference that have been sanctioned by the political calculating regime have impacted the relative cohesion of Syrian society. As the title of my talk suggests, this balance is fraught. In contemporary Syrian society, where a revolution that challenged 40 years of authoritarian rule developed into a decade-long armed conflict that produced the world's greatest humanitarian crisis. My use of balance as a metaphor for the relations of power in society originates in the aesthetics of Dabke practice. Known as mizan in Arabic, balance is a kinesthetic sensation between participants that anchors performance. Participants find their footing and rhythm in the Dabke circle by feeling proximity of other participants with whom they clasp hands or clasp shoulders. Dependency on one another is considered essential for anchoring the rhythmic precision of improvisational footwork. Without mizan, participants would not be able to flow in their movements nor lead the circle. The mizan of Dabke practice is therefore an apt metaphor for social cohesion because it suggests how Syrians depend on each other to anchor their sense of belonging and how stability occurs through interdependence and not in isolation. Yet, because Syria has yet to find secure footing, this balance remains fraught. Balance, as I conceptualize it, is part of a larger interpretive framework in which I developed the precept that bodies in motion performatively constitute relations of self and society. A key heuristic for this analytic trajectory is ḥarake, literally motion or movement, plural which is ḥarakat. ḥarake is a polysemic Arabic word that can refer to vowel marks in written Arabic, such as accents and diacritics, to physical movements, and to political movements. Ḥarakat in my formulation refer to embodied tactics that negotiate power in space in an authoritarian and repressive regime, that is, to bodily markers of semantic, embodied, and political domains. In my larger project, I regard ḥarake, one, as a sensate process in which social actors negotiate social spaces through sensory interactions, two, as an everyday tactic for negotiating power within particular social assemblages, and three, as a process of mobility that refers to how human actions situate in specific environments engender the social production of space. Today, I will focus on ḥarakat as an everyday social tactic, how bodies in motion are bodies that sustain, enforce, reinforce, perpetuate, and negotiate the distribution of power and capital in spaces of autocracy. Key to this claim is understanding that the body's privilege is a site for the reproduction of social class. As Pierre Bourdieu's argued in his practice theory, social classes reproduce their benefits and privileges from generation to generation through the cultivation of bodily dispositions and everyday actions that mask the socialities that they sustain. Applying practice theory to gender, I will analyze how the relationships of power that circulate between bodies in the Dabke circle reproduce, contest, and negotiate masculinity. As Eve Sedgwick argues, bonding between men, quote, if successfully achieved, is not detrimental to masculinity, but definitive of it, unquote. I'll detail in a moment how improvisational choreographies of power and privilege construct hegemonic masculinity between men in ways that legitimize patriarchy locally. And generally, my focus on ḥarake in everyday life makes legible the gendered and sexual dynamics of these performance spaces, include the queering of space through performances of desire. It also turns scholarly attention to the role of play, pleasure, and desire in masculinity, effects that are often overlooked in critical studies of gender and sexuality, especially in the Middle East. After looking at the performances of masculinity in everyday spaces of kinship, I'll relate them to a wartime geography of performance that demarcates spaces occupied by armed combatants, from schools and barracks to Garda Street corners. And then I'll offer a close reading of a dance choreography that crafts an affective geography of forced migration, and that asserts how, for the millions of displaced Syrians who've been forced to leave their nation, the movement itself is the appearance of the political. My theoretical approach to relations of body, performance, and culture attends to the objecthood of performance in ways that afford slippages and liminality, rather than ossifying form or codifying practice or affixing meaning. The heuristic of ḥarake serves to reassemble disciplinary threads in ways that privilege relational rather than distinct fields of study, and to blend rather than demarcate genealogies of performance in music and dance. My formulation of ḥarake is indebted to scholarship on the anthropology of body movement, dance, and music, each of which respectively address how non-discursive phenomena mediate culture and society. I'm also indebted to the study of performance as an object and analytic framework that, as Judith Hamera argues, quotes, illuminates the deep structures of community in and aesthetic practice, and exposes aesthetic social work as embodied, processual, rhetorical, and political, a practice of everyday life, end quote. As such, my analysis of ḥarake aims to make legible the affective, embodied, spatial, and temporal processes through which persons negotiate the webs of sociality and the balance of power in which they are situated. Begin with floating rhythms, part one. We're going to be down in the southwestern area known as Haran, here where the blue circle is. So to situate ḥarake in the social tradition and performance dynamics of Dabke, I'd like to present a Dabke circle that took place at a wedding of two brothers in the village of Jabal Khashab in southwestern Syria. This was an ars amia, which means a public wedding, or one where the whole entire village and neighboring communities are invited to attend, so there can be many, many who are there. Here's one particular moment where the participants at the end of the circle, in an area known as the rish, which translates literally to eyelash, broke out into a semi-improvised performance. When Ramsey al-Libby, a professional folklore dancer based in New York City, watched a recording of this sequence, the same that you just saw, he described it enthusiastically as nashla, like literally lively, active. Quote, nashla is exciting. If the music is a fit, fast people get crazy. The four people at the end are just an example. I remember myself with friends of my age when I was like 18, we really used to get very crazy so that our feet used to fly. Ramsey's evocation of flying seemed apt for what I had the privilege to watch in Jabal al-Khashab, buoyant acrobatics that maintained the rhythmic precision of the practice even as they flew around the shakal dara, or Dabke circle. The art of the Dabke is much appreciated across Syria. One aficionado recalled cruising Tartus, Damascus, and other urban centers to look for parties with exceptional Dabkun, plural of those who Dabke well. He suggested that a Dabke is one who floats. Like flying, floating is a paradoxical descriptor for a dance practice that is named literally for stomping one's foot on the ground. By suspending gravitational force, a Dabke sublimates the dominant aesthetics of this movement tradition, repeated steps and rhythmic foot stomps that pound the ground. As tropes that evoke the energetics of the practice, flying and floating embody what Maddie Schutzman describes as, quote, the paradox of flow, in which a complex pleasure derives from effortless movement just on the brink of a breakdown, end quote. Flow, according to Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, is a process by which the self loses consciousness in the very process of expanding its boundaries. With regards to Dabke, which is a highly participatory practice, as you've seen, I'm interested in how flow states emerge through the social life of performance, in which, as Thomas Trino observes, sonic and kinetic interactions between participants actualize social bonding at performance events. The betweenness of flow, both between the sonic and the kinetic and between the participants, is very important here. The thrills of flying and floating depend, in other words, not on the individual talent and skills of the Dabke, but on how Dabke move in sensory relation to one another. Central to their movements is a sense of balance among participants. Mizan entails a weighted sense of connection between bodies that emerges through touch, proprioception, listening, and other sensory processes. It is a balance of motion considering vital for maintaining rhythmic precision, one of the primary aesthetics categories of this practice. Being able to feel one another's weight and practicing rhythmic precision are considered crucial for a Dabke to perform at their best, to embellish, individuate, stylize, and improvise, especially at the head of the line, where the awal, or leader, is. It is akin to what dance ethnologist Deirdre Sklar theorizes as empathic kinesthetic perception, or a sensory process of, quote, feeling oneself to be in the other's body moving, end quote. Mizan is not only about the pleasure, play, and kinesthetics of performance, it is significant for actualizing a sense of self that I argue is situated, relational, and predominantly coded as masculine. If, as Georgina Bourne writes, quote, the fabric of the social results from collective flows of affect, end quote, Mizan and flow are critical to the processes of taste-making and selfhood constituted through Dabke practice. Moreover, as I will describe now, Mizan and flow actualize a selfhood that is not about individual autonomy, as often occurs in Western dance, but rather about a situated and relational masculinity. To better understand these gendered relations, I'll now turn to spaces of kinship in which Dabke mediates gendered forms of privilege and power. Dabke participation is highly engendered, as you could probably see from these various clips, insofar as the shekel da'ara is valued as a space for the performance of masculinity. This is not to say that women are excluded from participating in the shekel da'ara. There are many contexts, including this one, in which female participation is valued and expected. But the Dabke is perceived as a means to cultivate a normative sense of masculinity in ways that do not have a feminine equivalency. There are several ways in which masculinity is cultivated in the shekel da'ara. First, the awal, or lead role, is often reserved for elder senior men who are at the top of the social hierarchy of patriarchy, particularly at weddings, of which Dabke is a common ritual element. The social choreography of the shekel da'ara thus reproduces patriarchal hierarchies and kinship structures at once. Second, the participatory dynamics of the shekel da'ara, where tens if not hundreds of persons move in rhythmic synchrony, and gender and body experiences in which selfhood is distributed across neighboring bodies and the collective. When the majority of these bodies are perceived as male and at times queer, the shekel da'ara becomes a space for the performance and contestation of masculinity. When I first reached out to my social and research networks about learning how to improvise, I began by asking female friends to share their knowledge. My rationale was that it would be more socially acceptable to learn from those of the same gender due to social norms and conventions that emphasize same-sex sociability, especially with regards to embodied practices. However, none of my female contacts expressed interest or skill. And instead, they referred to me to their brothers, insisting through much and well-deserved praise that their brothers possessed the requisite skills for my perceived needs and interests. This redirection between sisters and brothers occurred in Jabhat Khashab, among interlocutors who regularly invited me to their village for what Dwight Conquerhood would call a deep hanging out. In between social visits to nearby family and friends and the corner store for ice cream and juice, we chatted about Dabke. After a female-only dance party at the bride's family's house before a wedding, I asked how often the sisters danced Dabke. One sister, a student at Damascus University, replied that it had been 3 years since the last wedding in their household and that they rarely danced so vigorously as this night. Another sister laughed and said she Dabkes as often as she walks each week. Quote, I could never tire from Dabke. I often play a wedding CD to practice at home, end quote. The first sister scowled, and she admitted she hates dancing, actually. Despite their different attitudes, they all deferred competence and skills to Dabke to their brother Muhammad. He, they assured me, Dabke best in the family. He practiced with videos in salon, and one sister left to go ask if he would show me some of his harakat. We moved into the salon, where he began to shuffle around some MP3s until he found one that he liked, and he tried to Dabke, but it didn't work. I'm not in the right mood, he told me, with a regretful look implying that he couldn't find the flow. And the sisters and I departed to pick up cold juice from the corner store. I later realized I'd seen Muhammad practice Dabke at the first wedding that I attended in their village. He was one of the young men in the Rish, which is the sequence that you just watched. And though he couldn't generate a flow state in the stage conditions of ethnographic research, he was an accomplished Dabke respected by his sisters, who saw themselves in his practice. By seeing themselves in each other, what Suad Joseph calls acts of intimate selding, the siblings mediated their relationships through the practice of Dabke. The next day featured the marriage of my friend's cousin to his nearby neighbor. Rather than a lively public village wedding with live music and Dabke, this family chose to host an Islamic wedding, featuring a nasheed ensemble of men reciting Islamic verse without instrumental accompaniment and without dance. After hours outside in the sun, the family and I stepped inside to take a welcome break from the heat. An aunt turned on Musica, a pop music channel playing Faris Qadrum's Al Khatayr Al Kaze, to create a festive, entertaining atmosphere. We formed a Dabke circle in the small salon, while several aunties and children sat on the sofa and watched. One uncle insisted on holding my video camera and recording the session so I could participate. As we circled around, I was intrigued by a young female cousin, lanky, athletic, about 16 years old. Enthusiastic, skillful, and full of stamina, she had distinguished herself at the female-only party held the evening before. She was more laid back in this informal setting, but participated with equal verve and rhythmic precision. Though our shekel da'ara here was mixed gender, and this was socially acceptable because it was in a domestic space, the cousin was the only woman to practice one particular embellishment that is quite commonly practiced across the region, called wahada wa nis, where you kick one foot out and stomp, and then continue around in a circle. Not only did this young woman distinguish herself as the most quick-footed woman in their circle, her embellishing figures boosted our collective energy and intensified our collective pleasure. And she was not the only one to animate our intimate shekel da'ara. Mohammed and his uncle led us around the salon, embellishing their footwork, improvising with the rhythm. Their coordinated, adroit movements as they improv on and around the beat conveyed their ability to be rhythmically precise, as well as their sense of mizan. And here's a short clip. It's hard to see what's going on, which is kind of the nature of these kind of sessions, but the aesthetics is actually part of the moment. Their playfulness, the laughs, the giggles, having fun, the who knows which body is exactly going where, underscores a key element of ḥarake, namely that sensory relations of gendered bodies in space emerge through performance or embodied acts of communication. Moreover, Muhammad and his uncle performed a casual, intimate, and family-oriented modality of masculinity, one situated in shekel da'ara with female kin and a guest, myself. These performances of masculinity are constructed by gendered relations between male and female kin, as well as between men. This playful Dabke session, as well as the casual remarks among sisters that I shared before, suggests how Dabke practice mediates healthy, albeit patrilineal, dynamics of kinship within the shekel da'ara and amongst families. I want to modulate now from looking at how Dabke practices a fluid space from recognizing intimate relations within families to how Dabke practices embody and index masculinity in the public domain on the front lines. In a set of YouTube videos that I've curated for today, albeit without permissions, I present a genre of war propaganda that circulated in network public life during the conflict. In these videos, dance is situated as part of everyday life on the front lines of the conflict. These videos featured soldiers and militiamen, some in combat fatigues and others in casual civilian clothes. Militia and army Dabke videos are a site for the contestation of ideologies of desire, pleasure, and leisure. Dabke realizes a particular group's claim to embody forms of pleasure in relation to an imaginary, though often named, other, in alignment with the specific politics of the Syrian conflict. Through Dabke practice, army soldiers express the power of the state, while in other videos, militia assume a performative stance against militant Islamism and the culture war over moral or immoral forms of bodily conduct. In a video posted on LiveLeak, a social media platform, on June 15, 2013, approximately 13 police officers, Dabke, and a security compound as others watch or record with their mobile phones. The lead dancer rotates a police baton in his free hand rather than the typical rosary beads. The second dancer clutches a gun while grasping the grip of the lead dancer, and all 13 Dabke around in a counterclockwise direction. They are exceedingly coordinated as an ensemble, each stepping the same distance in a precise meter. Their upper bodies are rigid yet poised, and they coordinate shoulder raises and front stops as if this dance practice were the product of rigorous martial discipline. The video ends with a pan away to fellow officers watching and cheering in a military jeep parked nearby. A window decal of Assadist propaganda, ubiquitous on vehicles before, now, and all the time, and even I saw one in Chicago, reflects in the background. In another military video, the title of which you can read here, The Pleasure of Dance is a prelude for the imminent horizon of violence. The video shows an army cadre before a major military operation known as Operation Damascus Steel, which took place from February to April 2018. It resulted in the Syrian army's defeat of opposition-held Eastern Ghouta. At least 25 soldiers, Dabke in a shakal da'ara in an empty field of a large military compound, you can see here. A Dabke song with the chorus, Ja'ina, Ja'ina. I prefer that to potentially what it says, was Shayna, Shayna, which is very close to my name. Anybody has any input on the song, please let me know. I prefer Shayna. Fills a compound with a low male voice, heavy bass levels, a shrill midwest melody, and catchy Dabke beats with recorded double. Soldiers milling around begin to walk towards the shakal da'ara and amass in the field, and several hold up their phones to record the moment. Some grab each other by the hand to form smaller Dabke circles. Others lift their guns up and down with the right hand as they watch. Altogether, the spectacle is an impressive battle preparation that all participants appear to take pleasure in. The video's caption, which you can't see here, but you can see on YouTube, draws attention to the prospects of martyrdom in the upcoming battle, stating, quote, "And if we die by dancing," end quote. Dabke practice embodies morale, specifically listening and dancing to a hyper-masculinized, militarized Dabke session that boosts the adrenaline of army soldiers, inciting them for a day of war. Unequivocal displays of power, these performances demonstrate the significance of embodied pleasure in spaces of militarized occupation. What is common to these and other videos that I encountered is the performance of hegemonic and militarized masculinity. Similar to the Dabke sessions discussed a moment ago, Dabke practice entails an experience of bonding between men that emerges through the flow of the shakal da'ara and the rhythms of collective footwork, and also the bass speakers, which is something we can talk about. Yet in the context of armed conflict, these performances of masculinity acquire patriotic overtones, both among pro and anti-regime constituents. Through Dabke, militant performances of masculinity are grounded in the figure, perhaps of the Ibn al-Balad, the son of the village, or the son of the country, a figure that elides in wartime intimate rural sociabilities with nationalistic and revolutionary fervor. These episodes clearly dwell on the darker domain of the conflict. According to the captions that narrativize each recording, the videos are taken when fighters are off duty or preparing for a military event or on break during active duty. Dabke occurs on the periphery of the battle event and during liminal moments of military life. Its performance not only marks the ebb and flow of military life, it also constructs meaning in a life dominated by armed conflict, engendering a sense of self that is consistent with structures of violence. Typically, the enemy subject is out of the frame, excluded from the performance of intergroup solidarity. Yet the subject remains a specter, an apprehension that looms in the horizons of violence and beyond, entangled with the space of performance. The embodied pleasures of Dabke are a vital force that accompanies, soothes, and prepares fighters for acts of violence. An instrument of war in multiple rhetorical registers, these videos instrumentalize dance within the greater biopolitics of armed conflict and human rights abuses. Indelibly made part of the cultural frontline through an archive of recorded video, Dabke aggravates violence, conflict, and war. It is not the only dance style enjoyed by soldiers of war. Fighters dance to an Usher song in one viral video and breakdanced in another. And another separate one, FSA, Free Syrian Army fighters, dance a traditional line dance closely related to but distinct from Dabke. But Dabke is featured in the majority of videos that depict dance as part of military life. The singularity of this form, I suggest, can be attributed to the relationships of affect and power that circulate between bodies as they dance. It's part of how fighters construct the imaginary other in spaces of conflict, and it reinforces what are already intense spaces of bonding between men to which acts of violence attach. Male embodied action propagates the Ibn al-Balad myth of the militant subject and justifies violence precisely because of its juxtaposition with pleasure. The relations between violence and pleasure are particularly intimate in this video. Here are 7 fighters in fatigues perform an impromptu Dabke session in a classroom. One soldier bangs rhythms on the lectern while 2 or 3 Dabke at the front. The others watch while one records a session with his phone, and the dancer on the left takes a drag of a cigarette and eventually breaks off from the dance. They repeat a 6-count stepping pattern of left, left, right, and Dabke, or foot stomp. And they alternate between a resting mode, where steps are more contained under the feet, with the foot kicking casually out on the half beat, and breakout modes that feature complicated footwork, including crossing over in a double time tempo, stepping back while the foot arrives from underneath, or bringing the knees up high in a military march. Remains undisclosed, there's a vivid contrast between the soldiers in their army fatigues and the classroom. As dancing military subjects, the soldiers animate an institutionalized space of pedagogy. Their misfit appearance in the space calls attention to the absence of everyday subjects and activities, young children learning in this space. In her discussion of this clip in the context of its inclusion in Osama Mohammad's 2014 documentary film, Silver Water, Syria Self-Portrait, Lisa Whitting argues that Mohammed, the film director, is, quote, at pain to show the humanity of regime soldiers, at least when they are at rest, end quote. Presenting Dabke in the familiar space of a classroom is an effort to normalize otherwise excessively violent figures of masculinity. But I'd argue for a different reading of this particular scene, which appears but once in a litany of cuts and clips, some of which Mohammed returns to again and again. The soldier's moment of leisure comes at the expense of the greater carnage that the regime has wrought on the collective and on individuals. Mohammed has curated a dark amount of this carnage for Silver Water. In particular, a brief loop of a young male body curled up in a fatal fetal position, hanging in a closed doorway. The still body swings preternaturally back and forth, with enough arc to convey that swinging is an effect of the sheer mass of the body, rather than the natural movements of the body's vital systems. Loop appears several times throughout the first part of the film, most notably for my discussion here immediately after we see this Dabke session in the classroom. It is precisely through the juxtaposition of the soldiers practicing Dabke as a form of leisure with the ruins of the victimized body that the violence of Dabke is exposed. The transition between the 2 clips, I'd argue, is intentionally continuous, which is an unusual aesthetic strategy for a film characterized by dissonance and arrhythmicity. Mohammed carries over the audio of the soldier's footwork while the image cuts from the classroom to the swinging corpse. Contrast is shudder-worthy. Live footwork resonates over and across the bodily remains of torture in ways that clearly spell out a perpetrator-victim relationship of violence. The regular staccato rhythms of the footwork misalign with the swinging of the young male body in ways that accentuate the silence of death. It is a poetic critique of the performative nature of regime violence. The sensory and affective relationship of pleasure and violence is part of a broader construction of masculinity in the military and security branches of the regime. It certainly do not mean to imply that all those participating in regime actions are equally complicit. A wide range of ambivalences, coercions, and complicities engulf a complex moral universe in which these social actors are entangled. But in Silver Water, collective bodywork conveys how spaces of leisure and brutality are tangled up in webs of domineering masculinity. Dabke is arguably more than a display of state power or a performance of occupation and militarization that reinforces solidarity within groups. The practice enlivens spaces occupied by military forces in ways that reinforce the co-constitutive relations of pleasure and violence during armed conflict. Cultural performances such as these are effective at polarizing, galvanizing, and aggrandizing social actors, as they are at resolving, mediating, critiquing social issues. Political culture is constituted through these performances in everyday life that reveal the shadows of violence entangled with pleasure. Part 3, displacement. Perhaps similar to how the brutality of war illuminates the negative space of collective participatory bodywork, the mass displacement of Syrians over the past near decade also exposes new perspectives on this cultural tradition. In the last part of my talk, I want to focus on a 2017 choreography that examines how Syrian bodies have been conditioned by migration politics and war. A myth called Al-Zubair's Displacement pivots on Dabke, conceptually, politically, and aesthetically. It is a groundbreaking work insofar as it's the first stage production to deconstruct, center, and reimagine Dabke beyond the purview of the folk, the popular, and the populist, her Sha'abiyya. But I'm most interested in how Al-Zubair weds weight and movement to structures of power in order to critique the social structures that undergird Syrian state and society. Using the six-part rhythms of Dabke steps as a dominant aesthetic parameter for his choreography, Al-Zubair mediates a dialectic of hegemony and counter-hegemonic resistance through his choreographic imaginaries. Moreover, this fraught balance of power emerges through anguished performances of masculinity in ways that reiterate the gendered interdependency and relationality of Dabke practice. Al-Zubair, who was born in 1981, began his formal dance studies at the Higher Institute of Dramatic Arts in Damascus with a specialization in classical and modern dance. After a brief period in Beirut, where he encountered Europe-based choreographers through workshops and performances, he departed to study choreography at the Centre Chorégraphique National de Montpellier in France in 2011, and he later established his company, Hekma, in 2016. Already abroad, when the uprising began, he felt immobilized and cut off from his home country because return would obligate him to complete his compulsory military service, 9 months of which he had served before starting his dance studies in Damascus. In exile, he witnessed, like many others, the rise and fall of revolutionary politics and dreams, as well as the daily impact of war on his family's struggle to meet everyday needs such as electricity and gas. His family lives in Sueda, in the southern part of Syria. At the same time, he experienced alienation in his everyday encounters in Europe, where he is perceived, in his own words, as a quote-unquote black Syrian. And I'm happy to talk more about the politics of race and othering for Syrians now resettling in Europe. Displacement is born out of Al-Zubair's sense of disconnection from Syrians and Europeans, respectively, as well as the paradoxical conditions of mobility and immobility that shape his political subjectivity. In Displacement, which is 2 acts, first a solo, performed by Al-Zubair, and then a trio, formed by Al-Zubair with Rami Farah and Samuel Taskin. It is a 55-minute production with minimal sound lighting and set design. The work opens with a pair of boots on stage. Al-Zubair enters, striding to center stage with a carefully folded white fabric, which you can see here on the floor, in his hands. He pulls on black leather boots, perhaps for travel or perhaps for military use, stuffing his pants inside. By integrating his preparations to the work itself, Al-Zubair makes transparent the production processes of stage performance. Standing and facing the audience, arms hanging down on his sides, he initiates small foot movements that shift right to left, side to side, for 4 rhythmic pulses. His left foot taps forward on the 5th beat, followed by a tap underneath his body on the 6th beat. And this introduction establishes a cyclical 6-step pattern of Dabke that repeats for the entirety of the choreography. The minimalism of this introductory set of movements, albeit with an intensity subtly reinforced by the limited scale of motion, emphasize the elements of movement, weight, and rhythm that together structure this work. The dominant aesthetic form sustained throughout the work is that of the 6-beat rhythm, an iterative stepping pattern constitutes its performative mutability and incessant repetition. Having established rhythm and repetition as the building blocks of his choreography, Al-Zubair proceeds to craft narrative phrasing out of his 6-step cyclical patterning. The height of his knees, the sonic impact of the footsteps, floor work, and cardio attack all increase in intensity and scale into the complete cessation of movement when Al-Zubair collapses and surrenders his body on stage, exhausted. He kneels in a pose that signifies prayer and imprisonment, and that articulates vulnerability and compliance. He repeats this to craft a cycle building up and falling down, a cycle that relates themes of struggle and rebirth. Here's a brief clip from Solo. This dialectical motif reoccurs throughout solo, the first act of the work. Throughout, these affective peaks and valleys remain the constant position of the six-step rhythm, whose very repetition structures Authoritarian's movements, whether he stands or shuffles on his knees, whether his arms are raised high or down by his side or behind his back as if arrested. Authoritarian remarks that the constant repetition of steps and beats represents the, quote, forces that have shaped us Syrians, including military and religious forces. And the repetition in the piece represents the resilience of these systematic forces, unquote. The resiliency of the rhythm lies not only in ceaselessness, but also its precision. No matter how subdivided or aerobic, as you saw, Authoritarian maintains the tempo of the movements without interruption. He Dabke's al-mazboot, that is, with the rhythmic precision of a debit. The solo act of displacement is an emotionally charged struggle of a singular body with and against the social and political structures to which it is bound. Within this act emerges multiple subjectivities: a liberated subject, sexually repressed subject, politically subjugated subject, and an ethno-national subject. Yet their containment within a singular body attests to the struggle of the male individual against the regime and the social processes that support regime power. Though he does not remark explicitly on the gender dynamics of the struggle between a singular male subject and institutionalized regime power, Authoritarian offers a feminist perspective on how to endure the struggle in the second act of the work. Where solo focuses on the individual, trio speaks to the body politic. Three male dancers emulate a shekel dara at the start of the second act by placing their hands on each other's shoulders and taking brief solos in the mode of elbow dancer. Faces neutral and bodies tense, they Dabke in a state of perpetual distress. They raise their arms overhead at times, a movement of ambivalent meaning that could signify either an act of protest during demonstrations or a call for help during migration. Though anxiety manifests as a collective affect, it is somewhat abated by the steadfast momentum of rhythmically precise footwork. The dancers emphatically embellish their steps with double-time figures and wahada wa nus, striking the floor with percussive effects that resonate on the bodies of the audience. They circulate around each other on stage, creating a dynamic flow across the floor that belies the rigidity of their upper bodies. Resiliency, strength, and dignity through repeated Dabke movements emerge in this collective bodywork. They embody the relational masculinity of the Dabke circle through their intercorporeality. Such intercorporeality is further pronounced by interlocking patterns of hand clapping. This moment begins when Fraught clapping his hands 4 times, arms raised high overhead, followed by Authoritarian and Taskin clapping their hands twice. It then transitions into staggered rounds of interlocked hand clapping in which each dancer claps their hands 4 times, entering after 2 claps of the other performer. Though 2 dancers are always clapping simultaneously, it is never the same pair. The cyclical rhythm reinforces not only aesthetics of repetition, here transferred to the upper body, but also the interdependent relations of 3 bodies surviving displacement together. Moreover, the interlocked and staggered rounds of clapping displace the downbeat of the 6-part rhythm, which is otherwise dominant throughout the choreography. The effects of this movement texture are to emphasize the collectivity of the trio, perhaps suggesting that anxiety, distress, and grief might be assuaged by participatory collective interaction. The performative effects of the expansion from solo into trio in general are to deepen and make more intricate the embodied relations of male sociology that constitute Syrianness in this work. Affect is paramount throughout displacement, an anguished and distressed solitude that evolves into collective grief. Displacement is a powerful statement about the resilience of moving bodies to invisible and subjugating forces of power. Through the repetition of weighted rhythmic movements that pivot on and around the classic six-step pattern of Dabke, Elsewhere employs the labor of movement to convey an individual struggle against hegemonic forces, including religion, the present state, and media. His work, he claims, is an act of revolt. Angered by revolution and war, while witnessing the sensationalization of the crisis in Europe, Elsewhere expresses his affective world through movement. I dance, I revolt, he states. It is a deeply moving work that resonates with the politics of Syrianness in the present, and it is significant for how it tackles issues of political sovereignty in Syria by portraying the resilience of the individual as he maneuvers through tight spaces of governance. Violence appears as an invisible force that acts on the Syrian subject who struggles to respond with dignity and resilience. And as a piece about mobility and encounter, it challenges the construction of the refugee subject in dominant media narratives by manipulating techniques of performance to amplify the imminence of embodied performance. Grounded in Dabke as a form of cultural heritage that is once intimate and controlled by the state, also articulates the psychological conflict of self and society during war, revolution, and displacement. In addition to his political interventions, Displacement is artistically significant for how it positions Dabke on new aesthetic terrain. Rather than rehearsing imaginaries of identity and place that depend on the globalized aesthetics of folk dance, Elsewhere deconstructs social practices of Dabke in order to devise a repertoire of movement whose function is to critique state and society. As an intervention in discourses of sovereignty, mobility, and counter-belonging, Elsewhere does not aim for a definitive reading of his work, nor does he pursue a universal truth in the aesthetics of movement. What emerges as a poetic rendering of performance aesthetics is fundamentally social, generated encounters between the self and the collective, however fraught with balance. As I've suggested in this narrative across playscapes, warscapes, and the stage, ḥarake emerged through flow states, or embodied, immersive, and participatory experiences infused with pleasure. They're not immune from, but rather indicative of relationships of power that circulate between gendered bodies. Improvisational repetitive sequences, virtuosic and banal, ḥarake embodied the specific social codes and cultural values that construct masculinity, both hegemonic and non-hegemonic, in intimate, communal, and even violent spaces. ḥarake are what helped to maintain not only balance among those in the Dabke circle, but the social balance among friends, family, and community, and also ḥarake are what destabilized the balance, or the illusion of such, between social and political institutions in society. Part of the reason I approach Dabke as a hegemonic cultural form is to push back against a narrative that arose in the early months of the revolution, namely that Dabke is a popular street music and social dance is primed for resistance against state power. The anthem of the revolution, which some of you may be familiar with, Yalla Irhal Ya Bashar, iconicizes this narrative, which was supported by local accounts of Dabke protests. Arts curator Rasha Salti and art historian W.J.T. Mitchell would later likewise valorize Dabke as evidence of the wujdan, or unmediated bodily presence that spoke to the purity of revolutionary performance. I, too, wrote a short essay entitled Syria's Radical Dabke, in which I maintained the political potential of Dabke, long co-opted by the regime and now reclaimed through the footwork of the anti-regime protesters. But as the first season of revolution shifted into armed conflict and regime-inflicted horror, the war was also negotiated through performance culture. The frontline videos that you saw today are tip of the iceberg for how conflicting factions propagandize the same cultural material with their own ideologies and struggles and strategies. What I aim to suggest by looking at ḥarake as a tactic for negotiating power in social assemblages, whether military, sectarian, or patriarchal, or more, is that these tactics are taken up across political groups and not just among anti-regime revolutionaries. This is a fraught balance in which hinges the question of how Dabke both reinforces social and political hierarchies and empowers social actors to perform together towards a collective aim. As the frontline videos and many others circulate in network public life, they expand the geography of the Syrian war from the front line across borders, between factions, between states, between homes. Part of the efficacy as performance objects is that through their mobility across digital platforms, they engender the social production of space. In this way, they articulate another mode of ḥarake as a process of mobility that refers to how human actions situated in specific environments engender the social production of space. Of course, this process is not solely about militarized and occupied space. The work of Displacement points to the ways in which ḥarake as migration produces the figure of the stranger, wherein, invoking Sarah Ahmed, the desire to welcome the stranger is paradoxically linked to the hostility, suspicion, and xenophobia that accosts displaced Syrian migrants struggling to adapt to Europe in the mid-2010s. ḥarake are forces of destabilization that have triggered the politics of nativism and xenophobia on a transnational scale. Today I focus on how ḥarake are a set of acts, tactics, and processes that animate the gendered politics of difference in Syrian society, broadly dispersed and imagined. ḥarake also means to understand Syria's fraught balance as one not stemming from the fixity of sectarian identity, or the orthodoxy of religion, or the repression of the regime, as many mainstream discourses suggest. Rather, Syria's fraught balance is embodied, participatory, multivalent, and multidirectional. It is about how the relationality of performance in and as body, power, culture, and society. To understand Syrian ḥarake is, I propose, to better understand how performance imbricates each of us in complex webs of sociality and balances of power. Thank you.
So, well, first of all, thank you so much for such a rich and informative, honestly fascinating presentation. And yeah, it's funny because there was so much in there, and you in fact actually answered all the questions that I had already come up with. So no, I had to kind of come up with some new ones. So there was, yeah, as I said, there's so many things that I feel like we could dig into. A couple of things that struck me off the bat. It was sort of this idea of ḥarake, of movement, and I would love to dive into this question around displacement specifically. So I happened to see this work in London at Sadler's Wells, and as part of a Arab cultural festival that took place, I think 2017 maybe. And so kind of I have a specific perspective on it. So there's something about obviously movement that you describe, between obviously the movement of an individual body and then obviously the movement of Syrians, who have to, leave Syria because of the violence. And I was and you mentioned that you would be interested in talking more about the sort of question of othering, in terms of the displacement of Syrians across Europe and the sort of politics of Syrianness. So I kind of wanted, maybe if it's okay to start there. It was interesting to me to hear you mention the choreographer saying, I dance, I revolt, because in some ways, obviously that's true, but at the same time, the question that kind of kept coming up for me throughout your presentation was thinking about the gaze and for whom one is dancing. And so, he has been outside of Syria. This is presented, I think it's been presented a number of times now in a number of dance festivals. Because it's obviously an incredibly powerful work, and at the same time, it's critiquing so many of these issues that you're talking about. So I'd be interested in sort of hearing more of your thoughts on both that particular presentation and the way that it's been received, but also this sort of question of othering in general.
Yeah. For the specifics of this production, Authoritarian is very forthcoming about the politics of its origin. Except perhaps to his funders. But there's a reason for this, which is that he was not initially interested. He's very prolific in his works, in his sense. He produced at least 2 other choreographies, but he initially was not necessarily interested in a work about the migration crisis. And this is in 2015, 2016, when it was at the peak of what everybody's talking about, and very sensationalized. But he was constantly told by funders and audiences and institutions that many people would be interested in a work that addresses this, right? It is very, very fundable and very trendy. That moment has now waned, and in fact, many Syrian artists no longer have access to a funding cycle that was centered around the 2015 crisis. So this is what he managed to do was then create and fund a production that critiques the very nature of its production, the conditions of its production. And so I didn't talk about it here, but what he's doing as a director and choreographer is he's using the stage as a way to kind of, if you will, to use a cliche, break down the fourth wall between the audience and the performance. In other words, he, for instance, with the sound design, he initially had an entire sound design constructed of instrumental music and whatnot, but then in a workshop, it was suggested that the sound of his boots making contact and the footwork was itself a compelling sound design. And so what resulted is what you heard here, which is essentially the in situ, kind of diegetic sound of striking contact on the surface. There's one brief moment where a midwist comes in, but that's just the one moment where there's outside sound. And what that produced is the very liveness of his body being in front of the audience, where they're forced to hear his body making sounds. And in some places, I don't know if you caught it, but you hear his breathing being very laborious. He's not exaggerating because it is very much a cardio workout, but it is also intentional because he's using, again, the immense aliveness to perform on the stage. as a way to try and intervene in the Syrian figure at large being talked about, on French TV all the time, appearing in media clips that are meant to induce tragedy and tears and invoke sympathy and then get kind of, inscribed into discourses of what kind of, whether the European Union should be open to migrants and whatnot. And so this work is a provocation against also the audiences who are sitting there, because he wants to force them to reckon with the body in front of them.
An individual body in some ways as well,
yes,
compared to a collective mass that is, what is how this, refugee and migrant crisis are often described.
And that's one particular strategy. There are other choreographers and musicians who are less provocative in how they want to critique the audiences that they're performing for. And they're more willing to entertain notions of, here's my story, and I understand that you want to have an empathic relationship to that story. There's another choreography called Amal, which means hope, by Medhat al-Double, along with 3 other dancers. And this one is much more a kind of staging of a narrative that people might be familiar with, as opposed to a provocation. And so all of which is trying to reckon with, first of all, depending on the story of the artist, how recently they arrived to Europe, their training, the extent to which they have networks that are accessible to them, whether they have to break into networks, or whether they're simply stuck learning German for a long time due to the bureaucratic procedure of how one applies and obtains asylum. They have different approaches, and at the same time they're trying to produce a certain kind of ideal, and of what Syrianness is about, but in their everyday life they experience much discrimination. And whether they want to account for that on stage or not is an interesting kind of moral choice that they're making as artists. When they're off stage, they will receive much discrimination on the streets, be kicked out of apartments because they showered in the middle of the night, and apparently there's a new rule that just began that night where you can't shower in the middle of the night. All these sort of idiosyncratic ways of enforcing softly and harshly that they're not welcome.
So something else, obviously, those artists are taking something, traditional and making it into something new. When you think about the sort of question of tradition, and you talked a lot at the beginning about Dabke being so locally rooted, with even the maps in a very specific locations within a country, and at the same time, obviously, this is a phenomenon that has been globalized through technology, through social media, through the displacement of these. Of so many people. Obviously you talk a little bit about that, but I'd love you to dig into the role of the technology a little bit more, given so much, what you presented is stuff that has been circulating. How has that dynamic even shifted over the course of your research?
Yeah, absolutely. On a side note, one can actually now learn Dabke by going to some web videos, and that was not available beforehand. And I find it work sometimes to be very intricate and difficult, even though I have a dance background. So there is a certain level of accessibility that now exists. In the Syria specific case, I think it's important to get a very brief history of digital technology. And YouTube and Facebook and so on and so forth were banned and prohibited up until 2011. And then one of the first demands by anti-regime protesters were to open up these web platforms. It's not to say that they weren't used. Everybody was constantly going around them, and then the regime would create the software to block those, and then that would be go around. So there's kind of this, cat and mouse game going on. But in the first few months of the revolution, there was the regime did open up those platforms. So the YouTube phenomenon is in the fact that the revolution and the conflict and war have been so heavily documented by social media is also specific to when social media began to be accessible. Here I think the technology goes hand in hand with the creativity. When many are talking about the revolution and the conflict, they are quite amazed and enthralled by the creativity of especially the protesters, whether it be graffiti, whether that be kind of counter strategies, whether it be for women dressing up as brides and processing through a public market in order to say Syrian unity in the face of us being called terrorists, so performative acts, right? And that these then are immediately uploaded and circulated, right, across Facebook, YouTube, and so on and so forth. And through that circulation, they gain their own kind of what Untitled Chapter calls on life, a kind of a life of its own, right? And people will constantly repeat and rehearse and go back to these performances in order to feel a sense of connection whenever they are displaced. Or in displaced, I mean in an existential state as well as very real state, right? Because even if people are living in Syria in their homes right now, they still feel displaced from the Syria that was, right? And so this could be a reminder. It's also, especially funeral processionals, which in the early years became politicized as protest marches. These would be uploaded and circulated, and then people who are living in refugee camps would watch the funeral processionals over and over again as a way to feel connected, even though it was a grief-based connection. It was important to them, and also kind of an ethical standpoint that they not be too removed, so as not to feel the proximity of loss and grief that constituted it. So I don't want to say that technology is what enabled and caused it, and I want to kind of go into that determinist mode, but it facilitated circulation and through which people found new ways to participate despite becoming this, despite moving to Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon and then on to Europe.
You mentioned your own sort of experience as a, with dance as a practitioner, and I'm wondering if you would be interested in sharing a little bit about how your experience, that experience, sort of has shaped your scholarly work.
Yeah, that's fun.
Okay.
I wrote a piece on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'll kind of talk about it in two ways. I was trained in ballet, which everybody knows actually hinders your ability to do anything other than ballet. So there's that. But I'm also a musician, so I really try to, I listen when I dance, right? The two are simultaneous. And so when I was at weddings and at parties, I also was just like trying to figure out things like, what do people consider to be the first step of this cycle? It goes on and on, right? And people don't have really a language for Dabke. Like there's no vocabulary repertoire of movements. It's not like somebody can look at somebody doing improvisation or sequence and be like, and name the 5 different movements. People just, they perform, right? And they learn by watching others. So I wasn't able to draw upon similarly any sort of language or repertoire that pre-existed. And so I felt, but also having grown up in front of the dance mirror in the dance studio, for better or for worse, I was used to this autonomous kind of body, right? And here's this very participatory, very collective dance. And so I realized that I just needed to, well, to let go. That I needed to realize that there was this sort of like, that people moved in relation to what each other were doing, and it was less about trying to do it perfectly by yourself. And the other way is that when some people were teaching me, they would tell me that in order for them to improvise and lead, they needed me to be a strong anchor. They needed me to keep the rhythm steady, and that somebody can't just improvise on their own. They absolutely need the person on the side of them. And so that also was kind of, I had to also recalibrate my own, proprioception and how I was using my body. And then I was like, oh, now I finally get it. And what's interesting is one dancer, Dabke, who was one who directed and choreographed Amal, he now regularly teaches Dabke workshops in Berlin. It's one of those kinds of workshops where he's in the middle of the room of usually radial system, if anybody knows Berlin, with a marley floor, so it's a very kind of formalized space, and he has a microphone, and there's 90 usually Germans and Europeans, not very many Syrians, because Syrians are like, I don't need to learn Dabke from you. But he's consistently offered these along with a percussionist, Ali Hassan, since their arrival and since they began collaborating with Sasha Waltz and Guest, a preeminent German dance company. And this kind of gets into the politics of the other, because the Germans are arriving there in order to do a cross-cultural maneuver of coming to know the dance of the migrants, right? And so it's a way to kind of build that connection and establish empathy and solidarity and alliance at the same time that it's also reinforcing that othering subject. And Adobel is aware of that. He's not particularly affected for his own political reasons and kind of self-made reasons. He is interested in succeeding and reaching broad audiences. But what he's done in reflection as he keeps teaching these is he's made them more of a moment of self-care among the participants. So he opens with a meditation. He does warm-ups. Warm-ups have never been part of Dabke because it's not a formalized pedagogy. You just go out and dance, right? But he's like, let's take care of this body. It also reflects his disciplining as a dancer. And so he also kind of is turning the gaze back on the participants themselves rather than upon this pedagogical object, which is the Muslim, the Arab, the European, other of Europe. So there's a tension there that is ultimately helping Adobel thrive, I think.
So one more thing I wanted to ask you about before we turn over to questions from everyone else. You had interested in kind of continue on the same line of questioning around sort of like the relationship between kind of creative practice and scholarly work. You put together this really interesting audiography about. I listen to it. I do. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. So obviously we talked a lot about the dance side of your work. I'm interested in kind of moving in to talk a little bit about the sound and about what does that allow for? That as someone who sort of primarily works with images and text, I'm really curious to hear like what is that sort of well, first of all to describe what it was, but also what that allows you to do and how that sort of takes your work in different directions.
So audiography is an experimental genre. Building off of ethnography, but using sound and audio work itself and to do the work of creating narrative about specific spaces and subjects and contexts. And so what I kind of centered this particular one on, it was driven, the motivation was that I spent so much time on the computer screen while the conflict and war and migration are going on, social media, so it was communicative, but still like very distanced, right, and whatnot. And I wanted to kind of grapple with what it meant to listen, both as kind of an empathic and communicative act of listening to what's happening, listening to people's testimonies and stories and whatnot, but then also to listen kind of acoustically to these stories. And so I developed it. It starts. There's a couple different parts. Remember all of them. It starts with protest.
I probably have it in my notes.
And so listening to some of the iconic voices and moments of the revolution, of the Bassel Sarut, who recently passed last summer. It was a soccer star turned singer who really drove and galvanized many of the early protests, especially in homes. So taking samples and trying to get into kind of affective space as well, using like a heartbeat in order to kind of drive forward what these protests are doing. And it's basically a sound composition, right? And then kind of getting into the thick of how it became much more of a complex moral universe where it wasn't so clearly anti and pro-regime, and then tracing what was kind of coming together, tracing how Syrian bodies are passing through spaces of hostility and encounter as part of displacement. So kind of tracking that journey through some different sound effects, but also trying to get at that tension through sound. In other words, the ways that Syrian bodies feel so unwelcome. Like how does one actually hear that? And so that's kind of the premise of it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You should look at it's about, how long exactly? 10 minutes? Yeah, so well worth a listen. And Shayna has this beautiful essay that goes alongside it that really illuminates what's going on in the piece. So I highly recommend it. But yeah, let's open up to questions.
So I have two very, very different questions, so somebody who's asking if you understand. The first question is about the patriarchal and militaristic aspects of it. When I watch Dabke videos online, I've always been very struck by that, and I've always been struck by that in contrast to what I grew up with as a little girl at weddings and so forth. From my memories, it was always the women who were actually leading things and guiding things. And I'm wondering if there are regional differences, because my grandparents' families are from Beirut, or if it's maybe my memory tunnel as a little girl identifying with the other women. And I was looking to them, or they were reaching to me, and I was wondering, like, are there regional differences in terms of those gender aspects?
It's hard to generalize and patternize. Generally, I've noticed that there's much more participation among women in Lebanon than in Syria.
So not my imagination.
Yeah, no, it's not imagination at all. I'm not sure why. And I don't want to necessarily conjecture that it's one thing or another, because that's going to become quickly Islamophobic, or rehearse kind of narratives of Beirut as being more open and more progressive, and Syria being a little bit more closed and a little bit more conservative, which are true, but there are also many ways in which that kind of the reductive binary doesn't exist. So I'm also very curious, but also with all the protests in the past 4 or 5 months, we've seen so many Dabke sessions have been led by women, so much female participation. So there's that. One friend does suggest, though, that religion does play a large part of it. This person is in their mid to late 40s, generationally, and has noticed that female participation in Syria has decreased as Islamization has increased. So it could be a part. His theory is that it is.
Thank you. And then my other question is more sound studies related. So those stomps, like the vibration that they create and the way that hits my body, like these low frequency vibrations, like there seems to be, like I feel it in my stomach, right? Like these low frequencies. So are there intentional, is that by design, in terms of trying to get people in sense of resistance, rooted into the earth or rooted into their bodies, as opposed to the lift of ballet?
You mean on stage, or in
street,
everyday kind of spaces?
Yeah, everyday spaces.
It's a practice that has been transmitted from generation to generation for hundreds of years. One kilim seller pointed out an older Kurdish kilim that he said has figures of Kurdish govend, which is a related dance, very similar. So its aesthetics are not in contrast or in comparison to another set of aesthetics, whether that be ballet or whether that be to kind of emphasize rhythm. It's because it is a tradition, if that's the right word. It's very hard to trace. And there have been some Syrian scholars, like Adnan ibn Zurail, who have traced it to the extent that they can, but nobody really knows the origins. There are many wonderful stories about the origins, but it's myth. It exists in the domain of myth.
So lady in the purple.
Me?
It's you.
Hi, I'm Annie Hallett, local artist, and I was in Palestine teaching large puppets and ritual to protest the wall that was being built around our village al-Walaja. And what was wonderful about your piece is I got to see what the men were doing, since in this village it was mostly segregated, sex segregation. So I kind of have a sense of what the women were doing. And I think we were doing Dabke at weddings, but more a shuffling kind of thing, but a real gathering of the females in the community. It was very important.
There's many local practices. Sometimes it's said that each village has its own. Sometimes
Right.
people say that, kind of circulates, it's more regional. But I actually noticed that a lot of it had been homogenized because of the media culture and media economy. Also because people take recordings of weddings and then those in VCDs, which include video, pass around. So on the one hand, people can learn each other's styles, but on the other hand, everybody kind of ends up doing the same basic 6-step pattern. So
I have no recollection of any media.
yeah, so there's
in
many different folk
in
dances.
Palestine. So
Yeah,
what I'm interested in here is I'm working with artists, Code Pink, and storytelling on the streets to communicate, our concerns, life on the planet, etc.
yeah.
And it seems to me that using these old ways of gathering are a very important way to communicate to bystanders, to people, driving under the bridges on the freeway where we've been working, that sort of thing. I'm just really interested in the power of communication through dance, theater, music on the streets, that we have to essentially participate if we're going to have an earth here.
It's true. I mean, there are also instances where it is fading away, where people don't feel that motivation, that power to communicate specifically through Dabke and other practices. They're at the Karam House in Istanbul, which is this really wonderful program that educates, trains, develops, and kind of rehabilitates displaced families. Most of those families, which tend to be more religiously conservative, are not passing on Dabke, not passing on performance traditions. The parents are not interested in doing that. So it's
More important things in front of them, just their survival.
it's also an ethical choice.
I see.
It's also intentional.
Thank you.
I have multiple questions and they're two-part related, so. Thank you. I had questions related to hyperlocalization in your ethnographic research, where you very much identify which village a particular dance is from. And it was sort of touched on the homogenization of dance styles and this sort of understanding of a shared culture. And I'm curious if there are any trends that you've noticed, both within Syria and then in the diaspora, for lack of a better term. And there's a lot of discussion to be had about that term.
Exactly.
But you will identify a particular dance or three dances as being from one village or from one particular area or ceremony. This is for weddings, this is for funerals, this is for etc. And then with the way that it is shared, if that is understood, like if someone from Damascus originally living in France sees a dance from Deir ez-Zor, they say this is my culture. Is like the question that I'm really asking.
Yeah.
Because you see this play out in different types of diasporas, and I'm curious if that has been the case. And if so, would that have been the case before the technology boom?
Right.
So an ongoing sort of discussion. And then the second question is, you mentioned briefly a Kurdish Gidim seller, and my other question was about if you did look at the folk dances in the north of Syria, if they count as Syrian with an understanding of that.
These are great questions.
Yes, because Govan Talpake that the Kurds do is very similar to the Arab Dabke that is danced in the Levant. And yeah, just sort of curious.
Absolutely. The two questions are related.
Yes.
So in the 1950s, when the Ba'athist state was establishing itself, this is before Hafez al-Assad took over, right? The cultural nationalists were really interested in Dabke, as many Arab nationalists were around, because it kind of embraced this notion of a collective people that could be bound by nation, right? And specifically an Arab nation. So in the process of doing that, and also in the process of moving Kurdish people out of their, of where they're living and displacing them and resettling them, likewise there's cultural erasure. And as you probably know, but for others who may not know, Syrian Kurds are not allowed to a basic level of cultural expression. Kurdish songs, regular festivals, and kind of like an annual cycle, were prohibited from the public sphere. And so no, Kurdish Govan is not recognized in Syria, and is not even Arabicized, and in fact it wasn't until I came back and was speaking with a Syrian Kurdish person that I realized there was a separate Kurdish word for the dance, and it was just not discussed at all also because of the limitations on speech within Syria, right? You don't talk about that which is prohibited by the regime because you're putting yourself at risk in many ways, and this is even pre-war, right? Similarly, I did not travel to ḥarake and to the northeastern area of Syria. Once I did for touristic reasons. Immediately got followed by that classic white, station wagon, which was fine at the time, but there was enough to focus on with the dominant kind of discourse and register of Dabke, and I wasn't interested in those risks that were entailed in working with Syrian Kurdish culture, because it's prohibited and forbidden. So while Kurds were being excluded at the very time that a sense of Syrian culture was being gathered in the 1950s, which is to say that Syrians aren't necessarily meant to all be together. It is such a heterogeneous space. There are so many different ethnicities, languages spoken, not only Kurdish, but Circassian, Assyrian, Syriac, et cetera, Aramaic, that it was really kind of a very concerted effort to gather all of this together into the rubric of some integrated national identity. And so dance was very much employed to do that kind of work, as we've seen in other places, right? This is how nationalism works. But it was specifically seen as dance is seen as a way to teach Syrians about each other, so that there could be this imagined community. And so to go and teach folk dance, the Syrian Dabke from this village to another village, was seen as a way that Syrians could be like, oh, this is what connects us. There's actually this difference of something that is generally the same. And so, you'd have like a children's folk group from Hama go to Idlib to perform at a folk festival, so that people from Idlib could learn what makes Hama, right? And so it was this like ethno-national identity that was happening at the sub-national level in order to create the nation state. And that's partly why it never worked, is because everybody knew it was being staged, and it was felt very false, and very much like top down, as opposed to, and also didn't follow through by actually, it's hard to go into this, but because it's such a sectarian regime and has been for 50 years, the actual reality of living sectarianized lives meant that this kind of cultural facade was just a hollow rhetoric.
We have time for one more question, so I think it's
So I'm interested in the politics of a couple people who've popularized Dabke in the West. Maybe the most famous wedding singer from Syria is like Omar Suleiman, of course, right? I think like 10 years ago, I saw this YouTube video. It's called Bashari Habibi or something, and he's like very pro-Assad. And there's this other person I think I heard a radio show from Mark Jurges, and he, I believe is from the Middle East. I don't know if he's from Syria as such, but in an interview you see he goes on about how the West is very, so unlike Omar Suleiman, he's not very pro-regime necessarily, but he's very critical of people who are critical of the regime, like in the West. But he, I think, is credited with popularizing a lot of world music or whatever in the West. So I'm interested in those being the people I know from the West, if you've thought much about these specific kind of instances in the West.
I published an essay about it in book ethnography, and my main question is, why is Omar Suleiman so popular? As somebody who's listened to a lot of Dabke music, I didn't understand why he was getting so much traction among rave festivals and media darling. I don't want to spend too long about the story. Mark Jurges is an Arab American, grew up in Detroit, is mostly Iraqi, and then began working with this record label actually based here in the Bay Area called Sublime Frequencies, that kind of takes an anti-ethnographic stance, but yet produces albums that are about local sound cultures. That's the way you could paraphrase the word. So Kurdish, who doesn't speak Arabic, did a couple trips to Syria and became very fascinated by Omar Suleiman. He just simply countered his music. I guess saw us at the market and was like, oh, this sounds different, and then shelved it away, and then found it several years later, and articulates the difference as being faster, kind of more heavy hitting, and so on and so forth. It's specific because it's actually blended with Kurdish music. And Omar Suleiman comes from a blended area, which is near the Turkish border, and then he plays with Kurdish musicians, so it's actually a very syncretic project that Suleiman has going on. Suleiman is a chameleon, is a man of many faces. Like most of who are operating this industry, the wedding singers, they want to make money, they want to get the gigs, and absolutely you're going to be pro-president or pro whoever they need to be, pro-Hezbollah, pro-Allah, whatever, and they'll, to every different audience, once they know that audience, they'll sing to that audience. So that's part of how these performers operate. Suleiman first kind of broke out of the Eastern Syria market. He was never part of the kind of metropole of Damascus, and so it was always a little bit delegitimized within Syrian scenes. And he broke out into Saudi. And then from there, Gurgis contacted him vis-a-vis Ra'ad Yassin, who's a Lebanese artist, and they began working together. It ended poorly, as a lot of artist relationships do, with Suleiman feeling like he was exploited by Sublime Frequencies and Gurgis. But generally, I think the reason that Omar Suleiman is so popular is because he his music hit before the Syrian war, but hit at a time in the post 9/11 area where Arabs and Muslims were very much demonized, and so those who were listening to electronic EDM music and rave were trying to really engage this liberal politics of embracing the other. This has happened with a lot of in EDM through the embrace of dub. Through the embrace of techno and kind of Afro musical traditions. And so it then got mapped onto, from resisting Islamophobia by embracing this very self-orientalizing figure. Omar Suleiman is so orientalist up there on stage by choice, right? And the way that he holds his body and what he dresses and so on and so forth. So kind of everybody's kind of playing up these more drawn out politics.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Shayna. There is